Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, thanks.
Okay. Hi. Okay, so we have a virus, it would seem, and it seems like it's about to go pandemic. So hence the title. I hadn't started out with this title. I was going to do my next EA Zoom Anima Mundi in the series 7, which was still down the maze, the labyrinth of the shining, and following the thread. But I had a lot of problems, as synchronistically, Jung would say, and I couldn't share my keynote presentation as much as I tried, and so I had to give up on that, and I asked Linda to postpone it. And she very kindly said I could, but then with the news and with the pandemic, and then with what I just found out, and I was going to present on my EA Zoom meeting for the Anima Mundi concerning The Shining, I thought this is too current, so maybe I could just say something and not use any slides. But then, I mean, Linda's a wonder, and she managed to get some slides on there for me with the offshoot from that presentation, which we called PAN-DEMIC. And Linda found this wonderful illustration of Pan, and the idea is to present what I found in The Shining, as I say, and my next step was to talk about the mind virus, it's called, which you may have heard of. I think Gemini Brett did an interview with, I'll show you the book, it's the easiest way, with Paul, I don't know if you can see that, Paul Levy, who's written this really good book, Dispelling Wetico, I think it's said, pronounced, Breaking the Curse of Evil. And I came across that. It's hard to, you know, when you're following the thread, the golden thread through the labyrinth, sometimes you forget how you find things, but it just fell into my lap. And when it fell into my lap, I realized this is what Kubrick was talking about, because he has all the Native American, if you've watched the movie, he has all the Native American artifacts in the film, in the hotel, the Overlook Hotel. And he seems to be talking about the Native American Indians, and the hotel in the story was meant to be on an Indian burial site. And he also talks about this thing that possesses, and that's what the story, he's converted the story from Stephen King's book a lot. He did a lot of conversion. But anyway, I'll go on with that when I rejoin that, perhaps, you know, in my next meeting. But for now, we have a pandemic on the way, it looks, and the world's gone crazy. And it just made me think this is just exactly what Wetico is. Synchronistically, this is what it is. It's the mind virus. And I found Paul Levy actually has put a very good blog about Wetico. And he mentioned that the science fiction writer, Philip K. Dick, perhaps you could have the first slide. Is that about, that's about Philip K. Dick, I think, isn't it, Linda? The first slide. Is it there? Hello? Okay. Right, so this is a really good illustration of Philip K. Dick. Obviously, they've combined it with a photograph of his, or perhaps it's all a sketch, but it's very good. And I put it next to his chart because it's really interesting how his chart connects with this. Anyway, in this blog, Paul Levy, who's the author of the book, writes about Philip K. Dick because he had what he called his exegesis. And it was when he hadn't been interested in Gnosticism, which is, by the way, going back to The Shining, what Stanley Kubrick is the underlying main meaning of the film. The Gnostic Gospels, the Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, alchemy, because obviously this is his thing. You can see it if you look then in his other movies, but it's very much in The Shining. Anyway, so Paul Levy talks about Philip K. Dick, and he says in this, oh, sorry, that's my dog. Gordon. There is something terribly wrong in our world. The Native American people have a term, Wetico, that can really help us to contextualize and get more of a handle on the ever-unfolding catastrophe playing out all over our planet. He's obviously talking back then. By the way, Philip K. Dick died in 1982, and his exegesis, which you can see here, the chart for it, which he'll go on to talk about, took place in 1974. The date was, and actually I'll say the transits of this first. The transits of this, I think that's his chart. We'll look at his chart first. As you can see, he's got, the main thing you notice about it, he's got Uranus on the ascendant in Aries, exactly on the ascendant. It's amazing. And it's making a T-square to his Sun, his Mercury, and his Saturn up on the midheaven, and down below Mars on the IC in Cancer. So it's making this cardinal T-square, which is so powerful. And of course, Mars rules the ascendant of Aries, almost 0 degrees Aries. It's just so full on. And it describes Philip K. Dick because he was a full on person. But so you can have a look at his chart while, and that moon in Aquarius, his sort of tapping into the cosmos. He was known as a sort of a prophet because he wrote so many science fiction novels, but the first one that actually got made into a movie was, what was the name of it, about sheep. Very strange, a very, very strange title. Androids and sheep, do they? Don't know. Hold on, well, I'll find it. But anyway, it got turned into Blade Runner, which is a classic. And then there was also The Minority Report and The Man in the High The Man in the High Castle, the series, the Netflix series got made. So he was way ahead of his time. And that Uranus in Aries just screams out, obviously Uranus is the higher octave of Mercury. So it's as though he was a channel. He was a channel for all this information, and also not just a receiver, but a transmitter for it. And it made him seem a little crazy at times, but then it's like he was just plugged in to the universe. So anyway, I'll actually read you, while you're looking at his chart, this really interesting, before I go on to what he says about Wetico. Charles Platt of the New York Times actually interviewed him back in '79, which was 5 years after his what he calls his exegesis. So Charles Platt goes on to say, Dick wrestled with the nature of perception. As he described it to me, he said, I began to get a mysterious quality to sense it in the universe, a kind of metaphysical world, an invisible realm of things half seen. He favored Jung's concept of what we perceive as external, in the external, may be an unconscious projection. In fact, Stuart Douglas wrote a very good book, which I don't have here, on C.G. Jung and Philip K. Dick, and called them the reluctant Gnostics, because Philip K. Dick's Exegesis, as he called it, which was on the 20th of February, 1974, and perhaps we'll show the chart for that. We can always go back to this, to the natal chart. Perhaps we'll show the chart for the Exegesis, which is the next one, I think. Linda, there's a 5-second delay, so it'll take a minute. 5 seconds. Well, I'll keep talking while that's happening. But anyway, the book is very good, and both Jung's Red Book and Dick's Exegesis were published long after their deaths. Jung's was published in 2009, and P.K. Dick's was in 2011, respectively. Both explore their revelations in Gnosticism. Jung couldn't, as I explained in my cast on The Shining, which Kubrick included Jung's Red Book in The Shining as well on the desk. So he was indicating Jung's Red Book, which was all about Gnosticism, which was based on Jung's vision of catastrophe back in 1912, 1913, before the First World War. But anyway, it was all Gnostic. And in fact, I'll just show you quickly, that's Jung's book, Aeon, which is his classic on Gnosticism. He wrote it finally very late in life, because he didn't have anything to worry about his reputation being ruined, can you believe, by being associated with Gnosticism or with the Kabbalah or with astrology, heaven forbid. But it's classic, and Jordan Peterson described it as a terrifying read, which it is, but it's brilliant. So that's worth looking at, because that's basically what all this is based on. Right. So anyway, so so there's a tie-in with Carl Jung, with P.K. Dick. It's all, and with Kubrick's real intention, his main intention underlying The Shining, which is about the Gnostic, the Gnostic creed. Okay, so this is what happened to Philip K. Dick back in 1974, this is the chart for the February the 20th. At 12, well, I've done a noon chart for it because he doesn't say the exact time. So this is a noon chart for that date. It should be a noon chart. Yes, the sun's up on there in midheaven. And so he describes what happens to him as he'd been to the dentist, and he was taking some drugs for that, but he had run out of painkillers, so he was expecting someone from the dentist's office to turn up at his apartment with some more painkillers. So what happened, he opened the door on this date, and a girl was there. He describes her as a dark-haired girl. He was very much like Carl Jung. He had already been very interested in Carl Jung for years, so but not in Gnosticism. He hadn't tied the two together. And he described this girl ever after as a dark-haired girl, and sort of a Lilith character by the sound of it. But anyway, which is interesting with the placement of the black moon. But anyway, Lilith. Anyway, so he opened the door and he saw her necklace, which was a necklace of a fish, which is the symbol of Christ in Gnosticism. And this gold pendant sort of gleamed at him. And at the moment he had what he called his exegesis, a sort of revelation. And he sort of was channeling all this information about the Gnostic Sophia and the Great Mother, and and the demiurge, and you know, not to go too deep into Gnosticism, but those main factors. So anyway, so what he says about it, Paul Levy has tied with Wetico, because it is the same thing. He's basically, his revelations about it were basically saying the same things. So what Paul, I know this is a bit hard to tie together, but it's very strange how it does tie together and quite difficult to describe. But I'll try. Anyway, so Paul Levy says in his blog, seeing how Wetico works, both out in the world and within our own minds, it is its worst nightmare. For once we see how it is playing us, its gig is up. So this is the Native American, what they called disease. And actually the way it came into The Shining was that the book called Columbus and Other Cannibals was published in 1978. And that was by Jack Ford, a Native American Indian by descent. And he wrote about Columbus and cannibalism. Hence, that's one of the reasons Kubrick includes cannibalism in the movie, and the reference to cannibalism, not actual cannibalism. But anyway, so he references that, and hence the American Indian, reference. And Jack Ford talks about, in that book, that was the first, book really in the West that was talking about Wetico, which is this virus of the mind. Okay, so Paul Levy says in his blog, there is no one definitive model that fully delineates the elusive workings of Wetico disease, but when all of these unique articulations are seen together, a deeper picture begins to get in focus that can help us see it. So he says that P.K. Dick had one of the most unique, creative, unusual, and original minds. Way ahead of his time, he was a true visionary and a seer, possibly even a prophet. Continually questioning everything, he was actually a very subtle theatre whose prime concern was the question, what is reality? Just like Jung, perception was the key to him, and obviously Kubrick. He used perception to demonstrate perception, perspective in his films. So through his writing, PKD, he refers to him, tapped into the shamanic powers of language to shape, bend, and alter consciousness, thereby changing our view and experience of reality itself. And he talks about, okay. So he talks about this exegesis, and what he was sort of, the information that came through to him, it was an overwhelming mystical experience, he explains it as, which he spent the rest of his life trying to understand and integrate. He was thrown into a crisis of revelation, feeling an inner demand to understand what had been revealed to him. Okay, so he called what was revealed to him the black iron prison, which is the same thing that Wetico is described as in other language. He said, we are trapped in a dream of our own making. PKD writes, we are in a kind of prison, but do not know it. Becoming aware of our imprisonment, however, is the first crucial step in becoming free of it. One of the main terms PKD coined to describe Wetico is the black iron prison. The black iron prison is a vast, complex life form, organism, which protects itself by inducing a negative hallucination of it. By negative hallucination, PKD means that instead of seeing what is not there, it cannot see what is there. In PKD's words, the criminal virus controls by occluding, putting us in a sort of half sleep. The occlusion is self-perpetuating. It makes us unaware of it, Being so self-perpetuating, this occlusion is our consciousness. In our consciousness will not go away of its own accord. It acts as this feedback loop that perpetually self-generates until we manage to break its spell. The very occlusion itself prevents us from assessing, overcoming, or being aware of the occlusion. Speaking of the difficulty of seeing Wetico, we alter it by perceiving it, since we are not outside it. And this was what actually brilliantly Stanley Kubrick was demonstrating in The Shining. As our view shifts, it shifts. In a sense, it is not there at all. Similar to how an image in a dream doesn't exist separate from the mind of the dreamer, Wetico does not objectively exist, independent from the mind that is perceiving it. In our encounter with Wetico, we find ourselves in a situation where we are confronted practically face to face with the unconscious, both its light and darker halves. In his Exegesis, P.K. Dick, there's so much, but I have to obviously prune it a bit. We got entangled in enchantment, a gingerbread cottage. Interesting, he makes that analogy, because that's exactly what Kubrick mentioned. Well, he mentioned it surreptitiously in the film by the phrase, this hotel is like a maze. You have to follow a trail of breadcrumbs to find your way through it. That was a remark that Wendy made in the kitchen. And that refers to the gingerbread cottage. So he's saying we got entangled in enchantment, but the weird thing here is that Kubrick couldn't have, because the Exegesis wasn't even published till after P.K. Dick's death, that he couldn't have seen his Exegesis. But I mean, he was in Hollywood at the same time, and also after his Exegesis, P.K. Dick did publish an article in the Gnostic magazine. So it's very likely also that Kubrick would have seen that, come across it. So, okay, so we are enslaved, we are trapped, as if living with a mythic or fairy tale reality. Our species is under a bewitchment, a seeming curse of massive proportions. Contemplating the basic condition of life, P.K. Dick writes that each one of us will be required to violate our own identity. This is the curse at work, the curse that feeds off all life. It sounds pretty, I know, negative at this point, but it's not. Not in the long term. This curse that feeds on life is another name for Wetico. Thankfully, in his writings, PKD gives us clues regarding how to break out of this curse. As of course, I mean, this is the same thing as the shadow, Jung's shadow, and of course, Jung spent his whole career telling us how to break out of the curse by confronting the shadow in order to integrate it. And of course, his findings on the shadow were based on the Gnosticism and the Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, which talks about the demiurge. This is an interesting piece, actually, and I'll just show you that quickly. And that actually, if you'll recognize that, that came up in the first EA Zoom cast on the Anima Mundi that I did. In Pan's Labyrinth, in fact, because that's what, and it led to The Shining. But that is Goya's Saturn eating his children, the famous, very famous painting. So this article is talking about the demiurge, the corruption of the demiurge. And that's from Montauk.net. And it's a Gnostic channel. But he says about what the Greeks and Gnostics call the demiurge is a universal intelligence that fashions our world. It is said that the demiurge converts aspect metaphysical archetypes into physically manifest forms, akin to your browser turning source code into a displayed web page. Depending on the source, the terms nu and logos are used independently or interchangeably with the term demiurge. Sometimes nu is equated with logos, sometimes logos with demiurge, sometimes logos is used instead of demiurge, and sometimes they are treated as independent concepts with some specified relation between them. Plato saw the demiurge as inherently good, while the Gnostics saw it as intrinsically evil. Meanwhile, John the Apostle equated logos with Christ. It's quite a confusing mess, it does say here. The traditional views are not all in agreement, but the demiurge is typically associated with concepts like implementing, manifesting, building, translating, projecting, which is a major trait of it, projecting, shaping, and perpetuating. The term implies a demigod with a blind urge to bring the unmanifest into manifestation. And it says here, I'll just cut this short, unfortunately, but it's a good article. For too many humans, their lower egos have shut off from the spirit. Their personal demiurge is corrupt and has shut them off from Nuth. But this merely mirrors a more universal manifestation of the same. Our world appears to be in the grip of an entitized demiurge with a strong self-preservation instinct orientated toward control. It fashions our reality and biases the probability of events in contravention to the divine design set forth by the universal logos. It is the matrix, which, you know, the matrix is based on Philip K. Dick's writings and on has a lot to do with Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, obviously. It is the matrix gone awry, the thought form of the universe turned parasite. How this came about is the subject of another article. Well, we won't go into that yet. We'll just go back to this. So PKD writes, it is as if the immune system has failed to detect an invader, a pathogen, shades of William Burroughs, a criminal virus. And all this was, well, this was in 2013, I think, this blog. Yes, the human brain has been invaded, and once invaded is occluded to the invasion and the damage resulting from the invasion. It has now become an instrument for the pathogen. It winds up serving as its slave, and thus the heavy metal speck, i.e. the BIP, the black iron prison, as Dick calls it, is replicated, spread through linear and lateral time and through space. The mind invaded becomes an unwitting channel for the pathogen to further propagate and spread itself in and through the field. And he goes on to say, a usurper is on the throne, which is ironic since this is a coronavirus. Now, the thing is, yes, it's coronavirus, it's in the world, but it makes you think, has this, well, according to Dick, according to Jung, according to Kubrick and many other great Gnostic minds, they would say that this has materialized. This is materialized through the human race materializing it. And strangely enough, there's in the Gnostic creed, the demiurge, it's complicated, but it is both good and evil. So the evil exists in order to promote the good. And we unwittingly cooperate with it. A lot needs changing in the world. We've been on at this for some time. We've been on about the age of Aquarius. And all that needs changing, and we've become very aware of that leading up to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. It was in January, and the lunar eclipse, the Saturn-Pluto conjunct the South Node. It marked like a 500-year period between this, really, when the Aquarian age began. And it actually, sorry, I've got to take a drink. Throat's drying up. And amazingly, synchronistically, events start to conspire. And it was actually on the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that the virus had its first death, which wasn't reported in China because it was being suppressed at the time. And the doctor who discovered the virus had tried to actually get the authorities to listen to him back in December when it first appeared. And it was caused, of course, they believe, by the markets, the wildlife markets. You probably know this. The wildlife markets, which are hideous, and they have all sorts of exotic animals all crowded together in terrible conditions, and then they sell them to eat. And like Philip Dick is talking about, you know, Wetico, and so is Paul Levy. And as Jung would say, the shadow, the thing is, we all have to own our part in this if we have materialized it. So it's not about putting the blame, but on the other hand, it has materialized in China, and China is manifested and has manifested this particular, I mean, different nations do. All different nations have down in the past. China used to be, I mean, you know, for 3,000 years, it was an amazingly wise and ancient civilization it comes from. And it's only since communist China that these practices really probably have got worse, because the government probably lets the populace, the mindless populace, do it. Take part in it, because that's their channel for being suppressed. Because if you suppress something, it will come out some other way. And wisely, the government knows that they have that outlet. And so they express their anger and their cruelty, on cruelty to animals mainly, as well as the dog and cat, you know, the dog and cat markets, which are abominable. The cruelty, and we see it now on the internet. Now, weirdly, of course, we wouldn't have all these computers we're looking at now on our phones and everything else that I'm speaking on. Most of this equipment comes from China, and we're able to afford it because it comes from China. And paradoxically, we've begun to know about what's been going on there and in other countries, the wars, the cruelty, or not just China, for goodness sakes. It's just that this has exploded in China. Because of, and because China is, I mean, it's becoming a world superpower. It already is well on the way. And so it's important that it's frightening if the shadow in China continues to grow, because that's very bad news for mankind. So oddly, we may have brought this in conjunction with as astrologers, we see the signs and we see the symbols and we see the transits, and they symbolize for us what is occurring and the process that is occurring. And we only have to look at the news, like I think I said in the Saturn-Pluto panel discussion with Erin, to see what is happening outside and inside us. And so we have, if we go by this theory, we have brought this about. But it happened through the markets and through people eating, apparently, pangolin. I don't know, they're a wildlife creature. I don't know, but it's to do with pangolins, probably, and snakes and bats. Well, it comes right down to the bat, which can absorb lots of different viruses and not get hurt, but then it gets eaten by other creatures like snakes, and then it gets eaten by pangolin, and then it gets eaten by people, and you've got problems because it is mutated. And it's exactly what the Saturn-Pluto is saying, because the Saturn-Pluto, as we were saying on the panel, is about boundaries. And of course, the 1982 virus was AIDS, and that was caused by a transgression of the species barrier, which is a boundary, and the body, and mutation is Pluto. So here we are, and it has materialized in China, but what's happening? Oh yeah, okay, it's scary, but it's not the Black Death. I mean, that was scarier. I mean, you don't go like you're decomposing, and pretty disgusting, the descriptions of the Black Death. It's like an advanced flu, and yes, some people are dying, but the amount of hype and the amount of fear seems to be more than the actual descriptions of the virus. So it makes you think that this is what the the demiurge would be described as, this is evil good concoction that we have materialized. Well, if we materialize this, then if it brings about change, and it seems like it's maybe doing that, it's a long haul, but it may be doing that, because China, actually, it was just announced today, China is just on the internet, in fact. China has just, it's just closed the first dog and cat market. It's closed wildlife markets all over China because of this. The people also, some videos have got out from people, young people mostly, who are crying for help because this has brought about, they see now the suppression that they just tolerated before, but now it's become intolerable. They are now realizing and that this has become a crisis, a huge crisis. And so they're trying to get help from outside, but of course that's hard to do because they don't even have free access to the internet. And as our part in it too, our part in this thing, think about it, we are complicit in those practices of what is done to wildlife and what is done to dogs and cats and what is done to suppression of people, because we buy the goods, and we're very happy to buy the goods, and we're happy to have our cheap clothes and all the products. Every single product has China marked on it, and we're happy to turn a blind eye, to stick our heads in the sand. Well, there's been enough of us, I think. We didn't think about that, but we need to think about that now. But there's been enough of us outraged by what's happening, and it is the cruelty to animals, the empathy to that has brought it about. And the crisis, the world crisis, what's happened in Australia with the fires, the coal mines, the outrage about the coal mines being promoted when climate change seems to have caused this huge chaos. So it happened in Australia too. It's happening in England. England is going underwater right now, and Boris Johnson hasn't even visited any person. He's just keeping out of it. He wanted his 100 billion rail line to go. I won't go into all of that, to go ahead, but he hasn't done anything about, and hasn't said he's going to do anything about flood barriers. People are starting to see the cracks are showing. Now, if this doesn't feel like Wetico, I don't know what does. But anyway, so I'll just say this about the transits that Philip K. Dick had. Yeah, that's the virus. If I could go back to the transits. Just quickly, because it's interesting about his chart, I'll just his chart go back to, perhaps, Linda. Sorry, it's my dog. That's not me. Okay, there it is. So that's his chart, that's his progressions and his transits oh yeah, okay, so that's his natal chart. So this process started to happen to him actually in 1963, which is 11 years before 1974. And he had a vision. He had a vision of what he then later called the demiurge. He didn't know at that point, but it was like a face in the sky. At that point, the transits were Saturn was conjunct his natal moon exactly, and it was square to his natal to transiting Neptune. So there's a Saturn-Neptune square in the sky that was picking up his natal moon in Aquarius, 14 degrees Aquarius, see it there. So that happened back in 63 when he had this vision. Also transiting Uranus and Pluto were at the start of Virgo. And so they were conjunct, and they were conjunct his natal Neptune, down there in the 6th. So, and obviously that is quincunx, his, or inconjunct, as they say in America, to his ascendant in Uranus, and his powerful ascendant with Uranus on the conjunction. So anyway, so then in 1971, he had another, in this process, he had another incident happen. There was a break into his safe in his apartment, and he called the police. Well, a friend, it's actually a very good YouTube video called the Gospel of Philip K. Dick, and his friends describe this. And so in 1971, there was a break into his safe, and he called the police. And the police said, "Well, maybe you did it yourself." That's odd, because I think probably Kubrick knew of that, and he actually put it into the movie when Jack actually says to Wendy about when Danny's attacked, when the vision that he has of and Danny appears with having been strangled. So Wendy says to him, "Look what's happened," and what happened to him, and Jack says, "Maybe you did it yourself." Anyway, so it's the same phrase. So anyway, so this really freaks Philip K. Dick out, and suicidally depressed, he flew to Canada and checked himself into a drugs rehab center. He made a joke that he had to pretend to be a drug user to get help, but a friend said most probably there were drugs in that safe. And he used to have kids around all the time, and they would sell him drugs, and back then, and so it was strange that he called the police. But anyway, he was freaked out too, and one of the friends on there said he might have been freaked out because of the CIA and MK Ultra. So that's the other connection to The Shining, which Kubrick mentions surreptitiously under the surface in The Shining. The CIA had something to do with MK Ultra and ESP investigations. But anyway, he was freaked, and he tried to flee to Canada and checked himself in. So when he got out, gangsters found him. Gangsters he hadn't paid for the drugs, it seems, and he told a friend. And there was a man in a suit waiting outside, and so this sounds like the personification of Pluto. Now, at that point, back in 1971, Pluto was it. That's when it had entered. It had just entered Libra. So it was exactly on his descendant, opposing his Uranus, squaring his Sun, squaring his Mercury, squaring his T-squaring his nodal axis, and his Mars. Couldn't be more extreme, and so no wonder he was freaked. And this was the personification, it would seem, standing there saying, and the gangster, Philip K. Dick thought actually said to him, "Sooner or later, one way or another, we all have to pay our debts, Phil." Whoa. But anyway, so he was scared to death. He thought they were going to kill him. So he managed to get back to California, where he lived. And, but he was seriously depressed. And March 23rd, 1972, he actually attempted suicide. This was all under these transits. And I should have put on the actual chart for then, but I didn't realize. I've come across this since and realized that this was the lead up to the 1974 Exegesis. And it's all started with Pluto entering Libra and triggering off all those planets. Also, Chiron was in Aries, early Aries. It had already been there, so that was conjunct, its ascendant, etc. And Pluto was in opposition. Well, it was in opposition to Pluto. So anyway, so the whole thing formed this cardinal grand cross, and he attempted suicide, but he decided to call for help at the last minute, and he was taken to hospital. Anyway, the result, a friend said, was that it cured him of drugs. He never went back after that to drugs. And then several years later, a couple of years later, actually in 1974, he had his exegesis, which was his Gnostic vision. Right, so I think we've got another Have we got any more? I don't know. Perhaps how are we doing for time there?
Oh, look, you can have as much time as you like today. You can have as much.
Great.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll just read you something from then his, interestingly, from his, this is what he wrote, Valis. And he, although his Exegesis wasn't published, it was all his private papers, and he never managed to publish it. What he did was he took his experience and put it into a book. And he based his experience of Exegesis on, and he called it Valis. And he said that Valis actually stands for, let's see what it stands for. Oh yeah, okay, Valis. So it's in the Great, it's listed here at the start, in the Great Soviet Dictionary, 6th edition, 1992. Valis, acronym of Vast Active Living Intelligence System, and it says it's from an American film. Well, obviously that's Blade Runner. A perturbation in the reality field in which a spontaneous self-monitoring negatropic vortex is formed, tending progressively to subsume and incorporate its environment into arrangements of information, characterized by quasi-consciousness, purpose, intelligence, growth, and an amirali coherence. So that's the short of Valis. But anyway, what it says, just a little quote from it then, he says in it, he calls it an eruption from the collective unconscious, Jung taught, can wipe out the fragile individual ego. In the depths of the collective, the archetypes slumber. If aroused, they can heal or they can destroy. This is the danger of the archetypes. The opposite qualities are not yet separated. Bipolarization into paired opposites does not occur until consciousness occurs. So with the gods, life and death, protection and destruction are one. This secret partnership exists outside of time and space. There is a mention in, a lot of mention actually in The Shining of Dionysus, some would say. And Dionysus, of course, is connected to Pan. I mean, Dionysus is Pan in some mythologies, or it's closely or Dionysus is closely associated with Pan, the god of Bacchus, the god of the woods, the god that has two sides. God is the savior. He is the savior and the god of life and celebration, but he's also the destroyer. So Dionysus is the carrier of the caduceus, which is Mercury, which is Hermes, which is the psychopomp. And actually, perhaps look at Stanley Kubrick's chart very quickly. Yeah, that's The Shining. So, by the way, in The Shining, that poster shows Jack is looking through what symbolize the two pillars. He's in the middle pillar and looking through it. That's what that door really symbolizes, the two pillars of the tree of life. So the middle pillar is supposed to be the way. We balance in the middle pillar in the Kabbalah, in the tree of life. And that is the way, not going to either extreme. We have to balance it. So anyway, Stanley Kubrick, and brilliantly, Linda has put him in the middle of Pan, because he, just like Philip Dick, he actually looks like Pan. It's uncanny. He probably knew that. I'm sure he knew that. Because he had both sides to him and he acknowledged it. Now that's a person like Jung had fought his demons, and Philip K. Dick, but also realized that he epitomized, just like we all do, God and Satan, the devil, the sun and Saturn. And the figure of Dionysus, the figure of Pan, epitomizes, Dionysus epitomizes both. Pan is the pure Eternus, which is the side that doesn't want to grow up, the side that is more likely to cause disruption. Anyway, Stanley Kubrick, that's his chart. And I was going to say Mercury, Hermes, the psychopomp, it really shows in his chart because amazingly, he was born the same year as Philip K. Dick, 1928. And, but he was born on the 26th of July, that is, and I meant to put the details on there, but you can just about see it up there. It was in New York, and it was at like 1:15, I think. It was 1 in the daytime, 1 p.m. But you can get that chart obviously off Astrology, which I got it off. They're very good. My Time Passages never works. That's the message. If anyone from Time Passages is looking, that's why I use Astroseek. Anyway, I recommend it. I don't, yeah, okay. Anyway, the psychopomp. Pluto conjunct Mercury up there in the 9th house, the philosophy. Venus up there in the 10th, obviously conjunct the midheaven. The Sun up in the 10th, popping into the 10th. The Sun is in the 9th. And it's just, yeah, it's remarkable. I haven't got time to go into the whole thing now, but what I wanted to draw attention is that Pluto conjunct Mercury, which is the psychopomp, is Mercury that can go down to hell. It can go down to hell, and it can then bring back its messages. It can make the connection between heaven and hell. And that's what he attempted to do in his movies. It's quite and I'm sure he knew, obviously he knew astrology, he would have known his chart. I mean, obviously, you know, I don't want to go too much into it because I have to finish this, but I will actually when I go back to The Shining on the other A Zoom cast. But anyway, so that's his chart. Saturn is Sagittarius. Yeah, it's amazing. Opposite. Yeah, it's wonderful. Opposite the Pluto Mercury. So anyway, so he brings up Dionysus. Now so Philip K. Dick talks about Dionysus in his book in Valis, and he says, okay, you worship a god and then he pays you back by taking you over. This is called enthusiasmos. In Greek, literally, to be possessed by the god. Of all the Greek gods, the one most likely to do this was Dionysus. And unfortunately, Dionysus was insane. Put another way, stated backward, he wasn't totally insane though, just like Dick wasn't, or Kubrick, or Jung. Half insane. Got to be half insane if you're a creator, right? Or an astrologer. But anyway, that's what we have in common with these giants. But put another way, stated backward, if your god takes you over, it is likely that no matter what name he goes by, he is actually a form of the mad god Dionysus. He was also the god of intoxication, which may mean literally to take in toxins. That is to say, to take a poison, the danger is there. But of course, the snakes hold the poison, but also, like Chiron, they hold the cure. The snakes up the caduceus. If you sense this, you try to run. But if you run, he has you anyhow. For the demigod Pan was the basis of panic, which is the uncontrollable urge to flee. And Pan is a subform of Dionysus. So in trying to flee from Dionysus, you're taken over anyhow. The Wetico gets you. He says, I write this literally in his novel. I write this literally with a heavy hand. I am so weary, I am dropping as I sit here. What happened at Jonestown was the mass running of panic, inspired by the mad god. Panic leading unto death, the logic outcome of the mad god's thrust. For them, no way out existed. You must be taken over by the mad god to understand this, that once it happens, there is no way out, because the mad god is everywhere. He wrote this in 1979. By the way, Jonestown happened in 1978. It is not reasonable for 900 people to collude with their own deaths and the deaths of little children, but the mad god is not logical, not as we understand the term. Now, amazingly, yeah, this is his books. He wrote so many. Amazingly, Kubrick brought the Jonestown massacre into The Shining in the form of the KoolAid in the pantry, because it actually happened as he was filming. And since he was using the film to demonstrate synchronicity, to demonstrate Gnosticism, the Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, all of it, and Jung's psychology, he put the KoolAid in the movie because it demonstrated exactly what he was trying to say. He was trying to say about Dionysus. He was trying to say about the caduceus. He was trying to say about the mad god that Philip K. Dick describes in Valis. Now, this Valis was written in 1979, but the massacre took place in 1978, November, and that's when Kubrick put it into his movie. So there's a synchronicity there that, I mean, maybe they met, they talk about it, we wonder, but maybe it's just synchronistic because they had the same idea perhaps in mind, that it was Dionysus. It's not unthinkable they would think that, because they both were, by then, Philip K. Dick had joined Kubrick then in studying the Gnosticism and the Kabbalah, so, and alchemy. So they were along the same lines. Obviously, it occurred to them both when the massacre happened that this was Dionysus. It was just encapsulated it. And the cannibalism, the cult, the mindlessness, that they lost their minds. They were under the spell of Wetico, of Dionysus. So that's remarkable, I think. So anyway, I'll just read a bit more of that and then I'll wind up. So a bit more of what Philip K. Dick says. He says, when you think you are out of the maze, i.e. saved, you are in fact still in it. This brings to mind the insight. Now, as I say, Kubrick might not have known about this, but then the maze is, I mean, it is a factor in the Kabbalah, it's a factor in the Gnostic Gospels, in the Creed, in the teachings. So this brings to mind the insight that if we think we are free of Wetico and it is only others that are afflicted with it, this very perspective is paradoxically a symptom of having fallen under the spell of Wetico. To quote Philip K. Dick, if there is to be happiness, it must come in a voluntary relinquishing of self in exchange for aware participation in the destiny of the total one. In a very real sense, PKD did find the solution to humanity's existential dilemma. He writes, compassion, that compassion's highest power is the only power capable of solving the maze. As PKD points out, the true measure of a man is not his intelligence or how high he rises in this freak establishment. No, the true measure of a man is this: how quickly can he respond to the needs of others and how much of himself can he give? In other words, the true measure of who we are is how much we are able to love. In the final paradox of the maze is that the only way you can escape is it is voluntarily to go back into it, as Danny did in the movie. Then maybe we are here voluntarily, we came back in. In other words, perhaps we have chosen to incarnate this very moment in time, i.e. our voluntary return to the maze has already happened, evidenced by the simple fact of our incarnation, which is to say that we have already solved the maze and simply have to recognize this fact. This is true amnesis, a loss of forgetfulness, which is a remembering, a recollection of our disassociated members as we remember our rightful place as part of a greater whole connected with all that is. I'll just do this closing thing, I guess. In that book that I mentioned, Stuart Douglas' book on Philip K. Dick and Carl Jung, he says, we are both the savior and the one who needs to be saved. We are that which we need to be saved from. reconciling the opposites, exploring the darkness, entering the door, Daleth, in the tree of life, the void, the abyss, where we encounter the demiurge Abraxas, the duality, the shadow. Okay, passivity, resignation and despair, and this is from Exegesis again, are intended byproducts of the lie of Wetico. And any system of thought which teaches these values, Christianity included, as a manifestation of the lie. If we participate in believing it and acting, or rather not acting on it, we involve ourselves in the lie and suffer, which only reinforces that particular lie. Like an astrophysicist who, by studying a black hole, causes it to change. The hologram piece came up. This is me talking, came up on our YouTube last night. You know, God in the machine. Computers, you put the right thing in, you seek, you follow the maze, you follow the thread, and it starts to help you. Now, that's God in the machine. Well, there's always the devil in the machine too. And we make our choice in this age of Aquarius. Which do we follow, the God or the devil? Because what we teach the machine, what we ask of it, will give it. It will give us. And we need to realize that. It's a wonderful, wonderful instrument of enlightenment and of evolution. But it also could lead to our destruction if we are not conscious and we do not, as Carl Jung said, if we do not explore and own and integrate the shadow. Okay, so Philip K. Dick says, we alter our environment by thinking, by imagining it. We make it, so we materialize. As it would seem, we have materialized the virus, Wetico, of the mind and the body now. So to wind up, there is nothing more crucial, Stuart Douglas says this, there is nothing more crucial in the salvation of our time than the restoration of the long suppressed feminine principle, the great mother Sophia, Cancer, the principle of Cancer, as in the last lunar eclipse that actually conjuncted the, went right across the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. South node and north node too. Okay, if there is to be a second coming, then that second coming is to be that figure, the spirit of the Gnostic Sophia, the great mother. In Gnostic philosophy, the soul, the daughter of Sophia, needs to be regenerated and restored in her rightful place in order to achieve the resurrection from the dead. Jung's Gnostic heritage permeates his life's work, and his unfinished project is nothing other than the restoration of Sophia. Humanity, as never before, is split into two apparently irreconcilable halves. Psychologically, we say that when an inner situation is not made conscious, Jung famously said, it happens outside as fate. When the individual remains divided, because the key is in the individual, as is the collective, both are the same, remains divided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, then we materialize. We materialize Wetico. Ultimately, we may be restored to a sense of wholeness by enduring the conflict and bringing the polarized opposites to consciousness, thus activating what Jung called the transcendent function. So, whatever the cost, the point is, what are we willing to sacrifice? What are we willing to give up? Are we going to let our fear rule us? Because do we want the good to rise, the Sophia, the wisdom, the goddess in the world, compassion, the spirit of compassion, of love? Because if we do, we have to own our shadow, and we have to say, well, we are complacent. We must be willing to sacrifice. And if we're willing to risk this virus, which is, we might survive anyway, but possibly would, a few will die, but a few compared to the world population. But isn't that worth the risk to bring about collective consciousness as well as individual? And that's our choice. And that's what I think Kubrick, P.K. Dick, and Carl Jung, who are just one of many others, have been trying to say. And now it's materializing, as is the age of Aquarius. Just one word on that. You know, we probably have another 100 years to go. It's been a long, long journey. 500 years ago, the age of Aquarius started to come in, to seep into the age of Pisces. And then the discovery of Uranus, which is the planet ruling Aquarius, and the revolutions in 1781, around that time, and the age of enlightenment, they called it, the age of science and the industrial age, and all the technology that it brought about. It's all about the age of Aquarius, but we're still in the process, and we're in, as I said before, we're in the dark. We're in the darkest part now, but the darkest part, like the winter solstice, is the darkest point before the dawn, before the light starts, and the light has already started. And as Philip K. Dick, in the future, it's already happened. So all we have to do is trust. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michaela. This was incredibly interesting and so pertinent for these times. Thank you so much from all of us. We'll catch you next time.